Hello everyone, my name is Phawx. In this video I'm going to be reviewing the Retroid Pocket 3. This is a device that, I'm going to be honest, I actually wanted to hate when it was coming in, but when I got it, perhaps my expectations were so low that they got instantly obliterated. There is actually a lot to like about this device. Even though I really love this device, it's still hard to recommend. So like if we take a look at the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, which is over here, or we take a look at the PS Vita, there's a few things that we kind of have to come to grips with. The Retroid Pocket 3 has the same chipset as the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. So if you were looking to get one of these devices for emulation purposes, they are pretty much the same. The Retroid Pocket 3 you can get with higher RAM configurations. In my particular version, I got 2 gigabytes of RAM because I know I'm not going to be doing much with it emulation-wise. I'm going to be using this more for game streaming purposes. And I'll touch more about that in a second. But if it has the same chipset and you're going to be playing a bunch of retro games and you already own a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, it's hard for me to recommend a Retroid Pocket 3 because you know the games are going to be playing on a better screen aspect ratio here as opposed to widescreen here. Yeah, you can play PSP games, but if you're getting this to play PSP games, you really should look at getting a PS Vita, because a PS Vita will play PSP games. Yes, you have to mod it and hack it. That's not terribly difficult, and there are some steps there to it, but you can get a used PS Vita for around $100. So you can get this cheaper than you can get a Retroid Pocket 3, and it'll play PSP games better than this, even though this plays 85% of PSP games. But this also plays PS Vita games. So it's really weird. It finds itself in this weird valley of hard to recommend. Like I didn't want to like these symmetrical analog sticks because I was going to use this for game streaming purposes. I really wish that the analog stick was asymmetrical like Xbox, so it's up here. The L2 and R2 are digital only, they're not analog. The start and select buttons are non-existent, almost as if they completely forgot about it and added it in the 11th hour to the top of this device. So select and start are up here, which is a bit weird. It's not the end of the world, but you almost get the sense that like it's reusing the chipset that's on the Retroid Pocket 2. It has symmetrical analog sticks. The start and select on the top. There is no back button on it. They use gestures only. So you have a home button, and that's pretty much it. You can use home and back or OK with the buttons themselves, but when you're inside of a game, there is no back button, so then you're left with gesture only. So there's a bunch of things in here that when I was looking at it, I was just like, what in the world were they doing? And despite all that, I still actually love the device, and I played a game to completion via GamePass on here. So I was at 100% battery life here, and I played a game for around 5 hours, and I was at like 35% battery life left. So I fully completed a game, not in one sitting. Like I left it on, so I was like playing for a little bit. I place it down for 10 minutes, pick it back up, and I play more. So the battery life on this is fantastic. I did a battery life test on this, and I got around 6 hours and 40 minutes with the screen brightness at full blast, volume at full blast, running a pretty hardcore Super Nintendo core with RetroArch. So you're gonna get around 6 to 8 hours of battery life on this device, maybe 5 hours if you really push it to the limit. But battery life on this is excellent. So for my particular purposes, like what I look at this, and from a game streaming point of view, which I will cover again in another video coming up, I really like this device. So let's go over what we have on here. Let's just touch base on what's on offer. Inside of the box, you can see on the corner of the screen. Now, people have been showing this off, and apparently this is not going to be here forever. Both of these, how I understood this was that the D-pad would be dome-based, much like the PS Vita is dome-based, and the face buttons would be membrane-based, much like how an Xbox Series controller is. So you have membrane on the face buttons and dome. How the Retroid Pocket 3 came in is all of these are dome, and for what it's worth, that's my preference. But they do also provide additional membrane-based here so that you can swap them out and make the controllers membrane-based instead of dome-based, which is pretty cool. You can also swap out the buttons so that they can be different color. You could also just do that as it is and make them Xbox layout. By default, it is Nintendo style layout, which is fine. Internally, which we'll get to in a second and go over like kind of the core feature set that you have there. you can convert that from Nintendo layout to Xbox layout, so there's nothing that you really need to do, especially when you're playing like Xbox game streaming, or if you were going to do like PlayStation game streaming, you can just switch that internally and then you're good to go. So we're going to touch base on the D-pad. Overall, the D-pad it's really good. It's a little bit interesting. How would I describe the D-pad? The D-pad has inspirations from the Xbox Series type of controller. It has this type of movement, this free movement that the Xbox Series D-pad sort of has, as opposed to the D-pad on the PS Vita, which is doesn't float as much. It's a lot more crisp in its feedback, and I want to say that this is a bit more mushier in context. And whenever you describe a mushy D-pad, typically that is like a bad sign. In terms of mushiness, what I like to kind of convey here is that when you have a mushy D-pad, the reason why it's mushy is you have to press down hard to actually, get an input. And that is not really the case here, so it's kind of a weird thing, but overall, the D-pad is really good. The analog sticks, we'll touch base in a second when we actually take a look at them. For all intents and purposes, they're fine. The buttons, the face buttons as they are here, are a massive improvement over the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. Now, the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, for what it's worth, the D-pad is worthwhile here, and the face buttons work just fine, except they have a high amount of tension to them. Like, pressing them down, it requires a good amount of force to press down on them. But overall, the control that is on the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus is actually really good. It's just that the analog stick with no clickable L3, and then this like weird slider thing here, this looks like a Frankenstein device. This looks like some weird cheap copy of what the Retroid Pocket 3 could be. Like, you look at here, and even like look at the logo of the Retroid Pocket down here. This is overall an improved, like overall materials, quality materials, the overall fit and finish. This Retroid Pocket 3 makes the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus look like a cheap clone, even though performance-wise it's the same. On the right-hand side of the device, you can see that we have a home button, which is kind of weirdly upside down from that particular angle. We have R1 and R2. These buttons are fine. You can press them across the entire surface of them. And for what it's worth, L2 and R2, I wish that they were analog, but the biggest gripe I have about them is probably just the travel to press on them. It's probably the worst part of the control on the Retroid Pocket 3 entirely. Not that that's that bad. And then we have the select and start buttons, which honestly, I mean, it really feels half-baked here. This is what probably makes me feel like, I don't know, this was designed at a weird time. I don't know. It's just weird. It's not terrible, but I still hate it. Then we have HDMI up over here. Here is the power button. Again, we have the analog sticks, and then we have our volume up and down. Along the bottom, we have a nice cover for an SD slot expansion. This is really nice overall. I like this much better as opposed to what's on the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. We have USB-C for charging and data, and then we have a 3.5mm audio jack. Overall, this is really, really nice. Let's go ahead and just take a look on what's going on the inside. Even when you go through the setup process and it's like asking you what kind of emulators and other things you want on here, I just went ahead and said, go ahead and give me everything. And there's a lot of stuff on here that you're not going to get any of the data files, so you'll need to do that yourself, whether that's like Morrowind or GTA. But even just the background with the nice Retroid Pocket up on the top, the type of kind of visualizer, music visualizer that they have as a live background. Overall, I really like it. If we go ahead and go into, let me go ahead and lower the brightness so that when I don't blow this out. All right, so now when we go and look in the settings, if we go ahead and take a look at handheld settings, this is where you're going to find a lot of the kind of really cool features that really kind of makes the Retroid Pocket 3, also the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, really fully developed, right? There's a lot here to like. So like there's the connected TV options, you have USB options. On the status bar, you can show network speed, which I opted to do. And then on input, this is where I really like to kind of hone in on here. So they have this like prevent the home button press, which is on the side, so perhaps someone's going to press it. I never had an issue there. I kept it on by default. Controller style, by default, it's retro, which is basically Nintendo style. You can convert that to Xbox, which is what I keep it as. And if we go to input control, you can see that there's a bunch of other different types of features like joystick calibration. If you find that the analogs are a little bit off, you can actually try to fix them there. You have a virtual mouse option, which is super cool if you're going to be playing, say, DOS games and you needed that. Google services. I mean, it's really cool what they have here and how far they've gone to really make the whole of it feel very cohesive. Really excellent job in getting that all done. Even with how they don't really start or give any ROMs to begin with, they just give you this really nice landing pad to just go ahead and install whatever you want. It also supports Android games, and I'll show that in a moment. But overall, it's really nice. So if we go into the gamepad tester to kind of take a look at the controls. So one thing that I would recommend here is that if you get the device, go ahead and perform a calibration within the menu that I just showed you before. After you do that, you'll be in a better spot. You can see right over here that on the top left and right, north, east, and west, that we're not doing the full box. Now, a lot of people, this is kind of up to contention. There are people that want full circularity here. I could care less if it produces a circle. What I want is full range out of this analog. And for the most part, if we take a look on the southwest, southeast side, we have full range there. But if we take a look at the northeast, northwest side, we got a little bit that isn't perfect. However, when you're playing games, this is really not going to matter. If we take a look at the magnetism of where it snaps to cardinal directions, if we just move it a little bit, and you see how it just kind of like blonks right back down? You see how that it has that magnetism, that like snap along the cardinal axis? There is a bit of magnetism on the cardinal axis, north, south, west, east. So there is, it wants to kind of make a plus symbol right here, right? So you can see like you are making straight lines, which is not very analog-y, but it's fine for all intents and purposes if you wanted to be kind of granular with what you're doing. The dead zones are slightly big, if we can just kind of get this. I'm already pushing it. So you can see that it started moving. The dead zones are relatively small, but it does take a little bit of motion. It's not immediate, so there is a bit of dead zones on these analog sticks. Overall, for all intents and purposes, they're just fine. I'm going to show you a quick demo on the D-pad, and typically I just kind of rattle off dragon punches here, and the game just closed on me. So the D-pad is excellent. Like, there is no question if whatever I'm pressing is the button that I'm pressing. You know, using the D-pad, just kind of going through it, you can rattle off dragon punches because you can feel. This is kind of why I prefer dome-based D-pads, is because the tactile feedback on what you're getting is so good that you can very easily discern what button it is that you're pressing, which is, you know, super important. That whatever you want to make sure that every input you press is deliberate. You're not just trying to smash the button and just, you know, smash whatever's going to happen. You want to be deliberate, and in fighting games that is exceedingly important. The D-pad on here is excellent. Really can't say enough good things about it. Again, D-pad, dome-based D-pads are my favorite. I love them a bunch. So D-pad wise, control wise, overall, it's truly excellent on the Retroid Pocket 3. I do think that the Retroid Pocket 3's D-pad is superior to the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, though the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus D-pad is, I have to say, actually decent. So that is pretty much it. We're going to start going into game demos, and I'll kind of comment on what you're going to be able to play on there. Because we're not really getting a performance boost on here, don't look at a lot of GameCube games being able to run on this. You'll be able to run a few, but you really shouldn't think that you're going to. For PS2, there are going to be some games, and we're going to demo these in a second. I'll kind of rattle through it, and I'll talk about them. Let's go ahead and get into that right now. Okay, my settings for Aether SX2 are pretty simple. We're just going to go ahead and go into app settings, and you're going to press the three dots over here, if I can press them, and then I just click reset to fast defaults, and this will introduce like all of the different types of hacks and stuff automatically to basically as fast as you can possibly do it with hacking a bunch of games where they still work. I still keep the OpenGL renderer, but in graphics I also choose enable widescreen patches and enable no interlace patches. You are still going to have to enable like progressive scan and widescreen in the game's options. If a PS2 game supports that, that's going to be giving you the best overall look. But that's it. It's pretty much simple. Not every game is going to run on Aether SX2, so PS2 emulation is going to be a little bit of a mixed bag. Some games will work just fine. Other games are just not going to have enough horsepower to get it over the finish line. Let's go ahead and take a look at some game demos. Now, it's important that even though we're going to be using the widescreen patches, that you should still enable in the options, if they have them, progressive scan as well as widescreen, and this will give you what looks to be absolutely correct within a 16:9 aspect ratio, and this is how you should be playing games that you want to have a more widescreen approach to PS2 games. Obviously, being able to run the game is necessary, and God of War 2 is just one of those games that is not going to be able to be run on the Retroid Pocket 3. Alright, when we get down to Dolphin Emulation, that is GameCube and Wii Emulation, these are my settings that I have here. I have tried using the Vulkan backend, and it overall is pretty not great. You have to keep everything at super low settings. Using Vulkan is kind of super busted and broken, but I have tried a few different games here, and outside of like Wind Waker and a few other games like Luigi's Mansion, those games are pretty lightweight as far as GameCube is concerned, but for the most part there's a lot of games that don't really run very well, so you're going to probably be limited to a lot of 2D based games. Overall, I'm not really a big fan of looking at GameCube emulation for the Retroid Pocket 3. I think you're going to find it yourself a little bit wanting. For Dreamcast Emulation, what's included is Redream, and you can just use the light version, so you don't really necessarily need to pay for the premium version, though I do recommend it, especially if you're going to be having things like Google Rewards, Google Opinion Rewards. They'll give you money for your opinions on stuff, and you can easily pay for apps and such on Android, which is another topic I have to talk about at a later date. But for the most part, Redream just runs great. Most of the games that I've been playing via Redream have been working great on the Retroid Pocket 3, so this is another area where it's really just going to be very good at Dreamcast and below. It's such a good game. If you've never played Virtual Tennis, really do yourself a favor. It's just so sensational. So here we have PSP emulation using PPS-SPP. Now, the thing here to note is that while there is actually a lot of games that'll play just fine PSP-wise on the Retroid Pocket 3, there are going to be maybe a few games that aren't going to be super playable. The benchmark game of God of War is not playable at all on this particular chipset, but because we have the widescreen resolution, it does kind of match more for what the PSP or the PS Vita would do. The only reason that I have the frame time graph up here is just so you can kind of see how well it does play on some games. Right now we are trying to run this game at 60 FPS, so we kind of want to be underneath that 16.7 milliseconds. You can see that we're kind of fairly always just above it, but for all intents and purposes when we're playing it, it's really just fine. You're only going to notice a problem again for like benchmark titles. So Metal Gear Solid for PSP, God of War, those games are not really enjoyable to play on the Retroid Pocket 3. So here we are again. Now this game is a little bit more taxing, but it also only runs at 30 frames a second. So now we're trying to hit 33.3 milliseconds or less. Now obviously you can see that we're spiking a little bit above there every now and again, but it's nothing super crazy. Like again, it's totally playable. For the most part, I have pretty much standard settings in my settings, which aren't anything really to talk about. I have OpenGL as my rendering backend as opposed to Vulkan, just because the PowerVR GPU that is on here, I'm not really the biggest fan running Vulkan on this particular GPU. Again, just to demonstrate like another game that runs at 60 FPS and runs really well. So for the most part, there's a lot of different PSP games that I threw out this, and I'm having an overall pretty good time with it. So you would need to enable frame skipping here to make this playable. That really depends on how sensitive you are to frame skipping. I know I don't really like frame skipping myself, but if we take a look at this frame rate graph, you can see that we're just not able to run this game properly. But again, for the most part, PSP 80-85% of the library should be playable. Most games that I tried were just fine. MGS and God of War being the only two that were not playable at all. And because the Retroid Pocket 3 is an Android handheld, it runs Android games. And because Stardew Valley is a game that just normally supports controller, the only thing I've done is internally is enabled Xbox mode, because by default, as you can see by these buttons, it wants to be as a Nintendo layout. But you can just instantly start playing, and the analog or the D-pad, whichever one you prefer, is going to just work just fine here. So if you do like Stardew Valley and you wanted a super lightweight way to play Stardew Valley for a long time, this is an absolute method to do so. And then there's obviously other Android-based games that will run just fine. So this is arguably one of my favorite features to use on the Retroid Pocket 3, and that is using this device as a console companion. Now, I do have Xbox GamePass, and one of the nice things about using xCloud is that any save file that you create on xCloud automatically transfers over to your console or on PC, provided that it's crossplay. But it's actually an easy way to pick up and play or carry over on your save anywhere that you want, which is really, really convenient. And in my opinion, Microsoft has this most solved over all the other ones. When you talk about like PlayStation streaming, that's cool because you'll be connecting to your console. So it's kind of super local in that respect, whereas the xCloud, you're leveraging Microsoft's own servers, and it becomes a lot easier to kind of just set up and go. But you're not going to be able to get this type of fidelity on, especially on how low power this is, but even that fidelity on high powered handhelds is pretty hard to do. So this is where it becomes really cool, especially how well it's been playing, and the ability to transfer save files is where it becomes almost invaluable. So if you were in the market for a console companion device, this is relatively inexpensive, and while I was under the initial impression that having these analog sticks be symmetrical as opposed to asymmetrical, like you would expect for Xbox, it hasn't really been all that bad. All right, here I am playing Assassin's Creed Origins. Now, this is a game that I have legitimately only played via the cloud. I have been playing this a bit on the GPD XP Plus, and now I'm playing it on Retroid Pocket, and there's nothing to transfer over. All my save games just sit on there. If I picked it up on Xbox again, all that stuff would just transfer over. I don't think the PC saves would work, because that loads up the Ubisoft launchers. I should actually test it out. I should load up Xbox Game Pass PC and try to load Origins and see if my save game transfers over. And if it does, that'd be super sweet, because then you'd be able to play across all three platforms, cloud, PC, and Xbox console, and have one save file that is managed entirely by, it would be Microsoft at that point. But I mean, like, look at this fidelity and how well it runs. The chipset on this device is perfect for streaming. I've had zero problems. Again, I played through one game entirely. I'll put it up on screen. Completed 1,000 of 1,000 gamer score. Fully completed the game. It wasn't that long. It was about 4 hours. I played 5 hours of it. And when I started playing at 100%, and I finished the game entirely in basically one day, leaving it on, and I had about 30% battery life after that entire play session. So that is like what this time that you see there, that 5 hours, was all at 100% battery and having around 35% battery left. So super impressive and a lot of fun to play with xCloud and using very little power. This for me right here is the actual killer app on why you would get a Retroid Pocket 3, is for a console companion. Whether that be for connecting to a PlayStation, that's going to be something I do for another video. I kind of just look at this from Xbox Game Pass just because that's what I've been using a lot lately, because I don't need to set up a console, because I do everything. You basically have all of these games available. You play on cloud. Save states all happen automatically through Microsoft, so it's super sweet. That is like my favorite function right here. Overall, I have been very impressed with the Retroid Pocket 3. This, again, Game Pass xCloud has been my favorite feature, but it is really versatile and kind of powerful for how much it is there is there. Again, even though we have the same chipset as the Retroid Pocket 2, when you kind of look at them together, they look like they were made by like two different companies, right? Like the Retroid Pocket 2 is kind of a mongoloid. It's super boxy. You have one analog stick with no clicky, and then you have this weird slider on the right-hand side. It's a weird Frankenstein of a device that isn't bad. Like the D-pad is actually solid. The face buttons, they're actually bad, even though they feel like they'd be trash. But they're good. This is a solid device. If you were looking at the Retroid Pocket 3 as an emulation-only device, and you had a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, I don't know if I could recommend a Retroid Pocket 3 if you were just looking at from an emulation standpoint. Yeah, you still have PSP and that's there, but if you have a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus already, I don't know why you'd get a Retroid Pocket 3 for emulation reasons. If you wanted it for xCloud, it's much better in that regard, and then you're looking at something else, and then that's at least worthwhile. xCloud does work on Retroid Pocket 2 Plus as well. It's just that this small 4x3 screen is not super ideal for that. And then if you're taking a look at thinking about the Retroid Pocket 3 as a PSP player, then you kind of also have to think about getting a PS Vita. Now, the used prices for these are around $100 on eBay. So you're able to get a PS Vita a bit cheaper than you can get a Retroid Pocket 3. And the benefit is that it also plays PS Vita games. So I don't know. It's a weird thing to recommend the Retroid Pocket 3. This is where I find myself kind of not knowing how to recommend this, because when I initially got it, you have the start and select up on the top. That was weird. I wasn't a big fan of having the symmetrical analog sticks, especially from what my main use case was. I would have preferred the analog stick here. I still would, but because we have this nice, just kind of offsetness, it's not actually that bad to use. It's actually quite nice to use. So again, it's really hard to recommend for a specific set of reasons. I think the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, I think the Retroid Pocket 3 is a great console companion. If you own a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus and you were looking at the Retroid Pocket 3 for emulation, I'd say don't get the Retroid Pocket 3 because the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus already does what you're looking to do and has a better screen for a lot of retro games. If you were looking at to get the Retroid Pocket 3 for PSP, I would say consider looking into getting a used PS Vita if you don't already have a PS Vita. If you already have a PS Vita, then just hack a PS Vita to play PSP because you can do 2x internal resolution on PSP and still play PSP games, and the PS Vita is a really great console. So that's pretty much my opinion on the Retroid Pocket 3. It is a fantastic successor to the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. Performance-wise, puts it in this weird valley of would you even get it if you have a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus? In my opinion, no. If you don't own a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, then yes, the Retroid Pocket 3 is, it style-wise, materials-wise, it makes the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus look like a cheap copy. It's a really super awesome device. Just really weird to recommend. Like, there's a lot of caveats here. That is pretty much my look at the Retroid Pocket 3. As always, guys, thank you for your time. And thanks for watching.